Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So actually, this entire panel kind of came to life during the VonCon of 2024, kind of in conversations that me and Kayla had throughout the conference. Kayla, do you want to kind of share a bit about the backstory?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as it like all the topics we discuss here are, very near and dear to my heart, and I know everyone's here because this is a fantastic practitioners conference. So one of the things we were talking about was like in my background, I am not a developer. I do not program things. I understand it. I understand the whole conversation. I understand the language. I know a little bit about it, right? But we were discussing the fact of as the role that we have in vulnerability management, if you do know all that, you're that much more valuable. But not every persona knows every bit of the story. And so just talking about who all's involved and a security researcher and a developer and the vulnerability management practitioner, we had this conversation of, like that would be a good panel, actually. Let's get all those personas together, all the voices together, and talk about how everything segments and how we can set each other up for success, but also talk about some of the friction points.
So here we are, basically. So we're gonna kind of dive into the complexities and the challenges in the entire vulnerability management process, and specifically about the tension, the complexities, and the different perspectives that each stakeholder comes into this process with. So maybe before we start, let's do a kind of quick round of introduction. So I'm Yotam. I currently lead the threat research team at Zscaler. Prior to that, I worked at a startup called Resilient for 5 years, led the research there, and also with a short stint of leading the cloud engineering team, so kind of more DevOps oriented work. And prior to that, I did a couple of roles in the PayPal security organization, dealing with insider threat intelligence, kind of doing data science, machine learning work on detections there. And yeah, let's start. Kayla.
Yeah, so I'm Kayla Underkoffler, a lead security engineer with Zenity. And the majority of the persona that I'm going to be representing today is the vulnerability management operator, which is my background. It's where I got my real start in security. So think, security engineer, security analyst, you're running the scanner. You're responsible for making sure all those vulnerabilities get to the right stakeholders in the right way. And you're not necessarily worried about the remediation of those vulnerabilities. Well, you are, but not hands-on. But that's my background. That's where I had my years of experience. So that's the persona I'll represent today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Havaya. I'm a security analyst at Snyk for like 3.5 years now. I'm basically triaging, tracking, and filtering potential vulnerabilities every day, making sure that the real ones are going into Snyk's database in the most accurate, complete, and actionable way. And we're working also on different projects like the rescore feature that Snyk has, and I was working on that, and it takes into account a lot of different parameters and like a lot of data analysis around that subject of vulnerabilities, mainly in open source and container. And today I'll be representing, of course, the perspective of the analyst, but also the perspective of the developers that always need to move fast, to keep up with deadlines, and that a lot of time feels like fixing vulnerabilities, those issues that they are getting in their backlog are a waste of time and just an additional task that they need to do and that they are expected to do. And yeah, that's it.
Hey, everyone. My name is James. I recently founded Latio Tech, which is a resource for helping engineers find security tools. So if you want my hottest takes on Snyk or Zscaler, feel free to let me know. But before that, I've been in security architecture roles for 5 to 10 years. I was most recently at PagerDuty, did a lot of our FedRAMP initiatives, which is enough to make anyone want to move on to another thing. And before that, I was at ReliaQuest as well as some different startups. And so I've been in a lot of different sized companies and helped a lot of people tackle vulnerability management. And so I'm representing the executive role, not because I've been an executive, but because as an architect, I've had to work with.
You're a CEO now, just
That's true. As
say.
the CEO, yes, as the chief executive, trying to help the CISO translate what they're trying to say into developer talk that's not going to create a riot coming out of their side of the house. And then even how that interfaces with product and who should own vulnerabilities and all of that. So how do we tie together all of these different stakeholders in a way that doesn't create too much of a problem along the way?
Cool. So I think we'll start with kind of understanding more about the priorities that each kind of persona brings or has in its role. So if you can each kind of describe from your perspective, just generally in your role, what are your key priorities? Kayla.
Yeah, so in the vulnerability management operator role, my main responsibility was vulnerability scanning. Ensure our assets are being scanned by the various vulnerability scanning tools that we had. So first off, there's a lot that goes into successful vulnerability scanning. A huge part of that is asset inventory, asset management, which is really cat herding. For anybody who's been there, done that, which I feel like is everybody here. Because as the vulnerability management team member, I was almost never responsible for the asset inventory, asset management, and yet the majority of my job revolved around that being done well. So cat herding in the form of asset management. And then from there, tool management, making sure all of my scanners were functioning properly, logging on first thing in the morning to say, did all my scans run overnight? Did any of them fail? Is the data flowing properly? Because the third part is communication of those vulnerabilities. So it's not just scanning, it's then making sure that the vulnerabilities that are identified are getting out of that tool and into the hands of those who will be doing the remediating. So that kind of made me a system owner in a way, because we had to build our own workflow in order to get those vulnerabilities into the right hands. But communicating vulnerabilities is another huge part of the job. And then, of course, you hope that risk reduction and remediation of vulnerabilities is also a core part of the job. But definitely when you're in the trenches, that hamster wheel gets a little bit challenging. And there was a lot of times where I couldn't focus on risk reduction because there were just so many new vulnerabilities coming in, and just keeping track of like making sure the scanning is working and getting those vulnerabilities out, that the idea of actually like winning the remediation game was kind of out of scope for my own personal priority. But yeah, that's a lot of what my role, the success factors in my role were.
So the main priorities of developers are to move fast, to keep up with deadlines, to make sure they are working according to planning requirements. And I think that like when they get those vulnerabilities, it's not that like they care about them, but it's just part of the big picture. And I think that like because of that, they really care to understand what really matters to them, and they really want to feel like they're not wasting their time. So I think that the main questions they're asking themselves are like, is this even a real vulnerability, or is this relevant to me in the context of my application or my project, or is it just blocking my pipeline for some reason and I even don't use that vulnerable function? So I think it's a lot about context, and it's very important to them to feel like they're not putting such efforts in fixing something that even will not truly impact their application. And when I look at that main priority, I would say that my priority as an analyst is to make sure that they get those actionable things and those actionable information, meaning that I want to focus on, okay, I have that vulnerability and that nice description that describes what the vulnerability is doing. but I want to make sure that they have what version is fixed, with which commit also maybe in the open source context, and what are the vulnerable conditions, in which context the vulnerability is actually exploitable and could really impact your application. So that's what I'm focusing on when I think about my priorities. It's like basically to help the developers to make more effective and smart decisions.
Yeah, I think the place that a lot of executives are in is trying to balance the compliance and technical requirements with just the business continuity thing, where most CISOs are in this delicate balance of how do I communicate the urgency to get these vulnerabilities remediated with a team that has their own business priorities coming from the CEO, that's to drive additional product adoption, push additional features, and trying to navigate what's actually happening on the ground level, where if all a CTO is hearing is from their developers about security sending me all these false positives, it's really slowing me down, I can't get my tickets done, then all of a sudden that starts to create that friction that CISOs are hearing from their team. We have all these critical vulnerabilities that could be exploited, our risk is super high, and something's not connecting. And so it's about how can we communicate to the business the risk that we're all facing, in light of the second you start pulling on the vulnerability string, the conversation gets super detailed and super technical very quickly. And so it's trying to, how do I high level communicate the risk to the business and the risk of this application we're launching? What's the risk of adopting generative AI? What role do vulnerabilities play in that? Without the second you start talking to the architect person, you're immediately talking about, well, it depends on our ML bomb and what models we're using and what different libraries and what are the CV counts and all of that. It's really difficult to communicate the high level business use case for why we're doing this in the first place, and how it fits into the sales model and drives revenue through compliance standards, while navigating like this inherent friction that exists where security teams are freaking out about the high levels of vulnerabilities while the developers are saying none of this is actually important or impactful, and why is it happening?
And kind of in the context of vulnerability management, what would you say that in your individual roles are you measured on? Were you measured on? What are the kind of the KPIs that you're optimizing?
Yeah, so my persona here is like the only one that's 100% revolving around vulnerability management. And so mine was 100% focus on scans running accurately, covering all assets, scanning properly, and communicating those vulnerabilities to the necessary stakeholders. And so that was like my measure of success for vulnerability management.
So I think when it comes to what are we measured on, first of all, it's important to say that developers are usually not measured on vulnerability management processes. They're measured on the fact that they keep up with the deadlines and that they're working according to the planning. But the vulnerability, they just get it as an issue in their backlog in the Jira board or something like that. So yeah, I think that that's something that is important to understand. And it reminds me a discussion I had with a friend like 2 days ago about that topic. I was telling her that I'm coming to the conference, and she's a developer. And she was saying, yeah, I'm getting from the security team those bunch of vulnerabilities I'm expected to fix. And they say to me, like, yeah, it's just 2 minutes, like just fix it and continue with your feature. So it really emphasized to me the gap that exists between security teams and the developers. And I think it's really important to understand why context matters so much. Because in that sense, if you can enlighten the vulnerabilities that matters the most in the context of your application, you can make sure that you put the effort and the resources for the right and the impactful vulnerabilities. And for the analyst perspective, what I'm measured on is, of course, actionability, as I already mentioned, but also making sure we are not doing poor quality disclosures. It's a real big and important topic. to ensure that we are reducing noise as much as possible. And yeah, to make sure that we are accurate when we are disclosing and publishing vulnerabilities, complete. Also, timeliness is very important, to make sure that everyone knows about that vulnerability on time, to make sure that they can decide what to do with it, and what are the next steps that they want to take. Yeah.
I think the hard challenge for CISOs in terms of what they're being held to account for with vulnerability management is the less vulnerability scanning you do, the easier it is to be compliant. And so if the main register is 0 vulnerabilities, well, if you don't have a vulnerability scanner, that's a great way to have 0 vulnerabilities. And a challenge that I consistently ran into as someone trying to drive cloud security programs was wanting to be an early adopter of a lot of very cool tooling that could do upstream malware detection, deep binary analysis, all of this stuff. And this is the stuff that gets us excited. But it creates friction with the organizational goals, where if I show my auditor, hey, I go 20 plus layers deep on transitive dependencies, isn't that great? And then the auditor says, oh, well, no, what are you doing about those? And it's like, whoa, I didn't want to actually do anything. It's just cool that I can show that they're there. And I think this creates additional friction, right? Because then I have all these vulns and I'm sending them over to the dev team and they're sitting there like, am I supposed to go to the open source repo and patch 20 transitive dependency layers down, how to fix something? And so really what I've come to understand over time is that security leaders need to have a realistic picture of what they're trying to accomplish with their vulnerability program, and keep an eye towards actual security risk reduction, where you're investing in like leading tools and trying to like really lead strong initiatives while you have the day-to-day compliance operations focus. It's a little bit how a lot of organizations I've been at, well, I won't pretend I didn't say I've been at, have done different pen testing, right? Where one pen test is for auditors that you're happy to have like a 0 result. And then you bring in a boutique firm to do the in-depth, like the real pen test, right? And in the same way, in vulnerability management, we should have a view of vulnerabilities that's more complex than just I'm scanning my servers, that's looking at container images, doing deep binary analysis, all of that stuff, but that those conflicting priorities can create a lot of conflict along the way. And the other thing I'll say is that different organizations, at first I thought if I can just do a bottom-up shift left revolution here, that I would solve everything, because I had great relationships with the development team. We were all on the same page about how the app worked, how to fix things. But just like you were saying, that they weren't measured on vulnerabilities, and that created, they wanted to fix them, but it wasn't how they were measured. And so they just had no incentive to do it. At another organization I was at, we tried pure top down because, hey, guess what? We're getting this compliance. We're going to do it. But then you just have this source of conflict where, because of the number of vulnerabilities, I couldn't add context. Like the number was too high. I had to just send them over to the dev team. And really, it does unfortunately require both bottoms up and tops down approaches, where the executive team has to be aligned on here's how you're going to be managed and set organizational priorities for how we're doing this. And you have to have the bottom level relationship so that when a developer talks to a security engineer, they're not wondering like, does this person even know what they're doing? Because it's so disconnected from the day-to-day experience. And I think that's the challenge that executives face, is trying to tie those realities together.
Yeah, for sure. So I think just by each of the personas are kind of articulating what they're measured on and what's important to them, we can already see kind of where the friction points are and what can be the challenges in terms of kind of how the organization manages vulnerability management. And I'd like us to kind of dive deeper into that topic, and I'm gonna throw out some specific topics and would like to get your different perspective on them. Starting with I think the vulnerability management #1 most talked about issue is false positives. Kayla, how did you see false positives from your perspective as an operator?
So when I first got in the role of vulnerability scanning, it was most certainly the perspective of everybody else that every vulnerability I gave them was a false positive, for sure. They weren't even going to question it. They were like, nope, fake news, don't need it. And so it took me a while to build relationships with those audiences. And then for me to also learn to trust my scanner to say, to have confidence going to these teams to say, okay, well, it found something. Let's negotiate on what we mean by false positive, right? There's a variance in the definition of false positive. So, and I know we have like a lot of topics to continue on to, so I won't get too deep into like definitions of what actually means risk or anything like that yet. But I had to learn to trust my scanner so that when I went up into an argument with an application owner or developer, I could say, all right, well, let's dig into the weeds. What did the scanner find and where did it find it? I can look that data up. You show me what's on your system. Let's do a screen share here. You prove to me that this is actually a false positive. So that relationship was critical to being able to overcome the false positive arguments because I spent so much time hand-holding application owners and developers saying, okay, but we found something. So let's dig into what that actually is. And then, of course, whether it was, well, we've just decided to do it differently. It's not a real vulnerability. So, that definition of false positive. In the end, we had to choose a place to start as a security team, as a vulnerability management organization. And our choice was if the scanner finds it and you cannot prove to me that it's a false positive, you have to remediate it based on the severity of the scanner. So like, I think now, in my wiser years now, maybe I'd have a little bit more conversation around, well, reachability and, what's the priority of this? But back in the day, it was definitely like, if the scanner says it's there, unless you can prove it's not.
Would you say that you said your kind of way to handle this was trust your scanner more? Would you say that you got to a point where you trust your scanner too much at times?
Yes, definitely, for sure. But that's where I always checked myself to have a screen share with the application owners. Like building that relationship was huge. They knew they could trust me and I could trust them for all of us to bring proof to the table. Like that was really where it mattered. But I would always take the side of my scanner first.
Naturally.
Yeah.
So when it comes to false positives, the definition, by the way, of false positive that I want to refer to today is like when we have a real vulnerability, it is there, it exists, there is one, but in the context of your application, it's not relevant. And I think that that's, like, to me, it's the most challenging thing to do because at the end of the day, we have like it's a never-ending story. We will always have more vulnerabilities and more things to fix. And we want to make sure that we add enough context informations about the vulnerability and that we have visibility also on runtime factors or also on the environment where the vulnerability exists to understand like, okay, we have the scanning found the vulnerability, but now we want to know if it's an actual vulnerability in the context of the application. And I think that that's really important. I see a lot of times vulnerabilities that are relevant only on a specific OS or on a specific environment. And if you didn't set up that environment, the vulnerability is not relevant. So I think that that's really important because if you're just looking at the vulnerability kind of metadata, you will just keep up with reacting to noise and focusing on the context in addition to the vulnerability metadata, of course, will help, I think, reduce that noise and make vulnerability management more effective. So I think it's an important thing.
Yeah, I think the answer here has to be split between if you're either under regulations where you have to fix vulnerabilities or you're not. And if you have to fix them, then it's about changing the conversations with developers, because I think developers will always look at a vulnerability and think in terms of exploitability rather than, like, to them, it is a false positive. Even though I'm using a vulnerable version, if I can't get an exploit across. And I view that's the goal of reachability and all these different tools that are out there and like the buzzword of the month or whatever is trying to show, is this exploitable in my system or not? And if you're operating at such a scale, like the developer has to be convinced, like you are not going to be able to create a satisfactory paper trail for every one of these vulnerabilities to prove that it's an exploitable issue or not. Like it's just not going to happen. And so the real thing you're trying to build, and this is what I think applies outside of more regulated industries, is we're really talking about building patch management in general. And I think that's why we've gotten so confused on container security and open source security in particular, because in Windows systems, everybody has a well-defined patching structure for it's Patch Tuesday, and we have a control group, and we run the test there, and then we roll it out downstream. But when you bring that to the application level, you've got totally different application teams, architectures, patching, how ephemeral their infrastructure is, who even has access to the infrastructure, what developers still there. And so really it's about trying to help developers think in terms of these tickets are going to keep coming. And how can we just make it so that it's not a big deal when they show up? So we're just like rebuilding our container images every night. We're trying to push towards a more ephemeral architecture, which is going to take time, but that's the goal. The goal is not how can I prove that every single CVE is exploitable or not, but it's how can we make it so that every time we get one of these tickets, it's not creating a 1 week, 2 week, 3 week long ordeal where we're having to have these conversations back and forth. So really that's what I try to emphasize is even before, especially smaller organizations buying more vulnerability scanners, really we should start by thinking about how we want to do patch management before we start worrying about the specifics of like what vulnerabilities are we uncovering. Because I know I can speak for myself that I bought a lot of vulnerability tools before I had an idea of, okay, how am I going to actually fix one of these? And it's because of that developer disconnect where I assumed when I sent a SQL injection finding to a developer, they would know how to fix it. And then I found out the hard way, like, oh, not all the time. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's false positives. What about false negatives?
So false negatives did not keep me up at night. Because of the level that I was at, the operator in the trenches. If my scanner didn't find it, then it wasn't a problem. And it's definitely not my problem if something showed up later because my scanner didn't find it. I'm not saying that's the right perspective to take. I'm not saying that that's, how every persona needs to think about false positives, but that was the truth.
So I have to intervene here because for me, I think actually that's one of one of the main problems in this process. I think in my previous company, we had a conversation with the client. And he said like, I like scanner X, whatever, because they don't give me a lot of results. And I'm like, oh, like, do you care about the number of vulnerabilities or do you care about your actual security risk? And I think that is also something that you don't really have visibility to when you only use one tool. So you don't, basically false negatives create security blind spots in your organization because you can't fix what you don't know that exists. And for me, what kind of really highlighted the depth of this problem in the industry is, again, my previous role, I did a research, kind of a benchmark of different vulnerability scanners and SCA tools, and I was blown away negatively from the results or lack thereof. And again, you don't really get visibility into that until you kind of put the results side by side, and then you see, okay, this scanner flagged this thing, and all the other missed it, and then okay, it's actually there, and then you suddenly start to see like everybody lies. That's the takeaway that I got from my research.
Well, I think it makes it if there's any auditors in the room, the difficulty with FedRAMP specifically is having to create then that audit trail of, okay, I have to explain to an auditor why did this scanner find these vulnerabilities, and then why did this one not find those ones, even though it found additional ones. But it's so much paperwork to have to try to show, like I'm basically guessing on the vendor side, like why did this scanner find it but this one didn't, that it's even hard to try to switch tools when you're at that level of regulation.
Cool. Havaya, from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that false negatives, as you mentioned, Yotam, are the most tricky ones. And in a sense, to me, it's the most, I don't know if the most, but it's very interesting because when you don't know there's a vulnerability, then you don't get the chance to decide on what to do next. And when I was working on a project at Snyk, I saw that even when we know about a vulnerability, a lot of times we don't know, we don't have enough information at first. We don't know if there's an exploit or what is the maturity level of the exploit because we didn't find the proof of that. We don't know exactly the vulnerable conditions, or like there are stuff that are missing. And it's at that stage that it hit me that when you don't know, it could be worse than knowing that there is a vulnerability. And I get that false positives are very annoying because there's a lot of them, and I get that there's a lot of vulnerabilities, but at least we know, and at least we have visibility, and we can decide and take actions accordingly. When we don't know, we don't get to decide. And I really agree with what you said. Like there's a lot of assets or packages also in open source that seems pretty secure because there are not a lot of vulnerability in there, but it might just mean that we didn't looked at it enough. Yeah, totally.
Well, that's what I'll add is we don't usually think of these as false negatives, but I think because of the emphasis from the vendor side on CVEs specifically, like it gets to the supply. When we think about our supply chain security, a lot of organizations equate that to CVE scanning, and it really misses the biggest risks to supply chain, which are like the XZUtils incident, the TJ Actions incident, like these supply chain incidents that are like really, really scary and dangerous have nothing to do with CVE discovery in the first place. And it requires a much more difficult look at how we're using open source to say, is this just maintained by one guy named TJ and that's why it's called TJ Actions, and like should we use this? Or like, but it didn't have any CVEs, and so you know it's fine.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I also see kind of a gap or a bit of mistreatment sometimes into this entire kind of supply chain risk, where people treat malicious packages the same way that they treat CVEs, but they're not really the same. Because if you have a malicious package installed in your environment, it's kind of like you already have the payload there. So it's not it's kind of CVE and exploit combined. So you need to see whether this thing actually ran. What did it do? You get into this whole phase of kind of incident response and a different level of triage. And a lot, maybe we'll talk about it when we get to the tools. But I think a lot of tools kind of try to have it all, and then they kind of wrongfully treat those two different beasts the same.
It's hard to when someone shows you a threat intel feed, that's not the aha moment for I need to buy this product right away. And that's like that's where a lot of the juice of a good preventative security thing.
And so maybe let's talk about kind of tapping into that. What are the differences from your perspectives in terms of how do we scan, where do we scan, how do we aggregate the results, kind of, because we all know there are different type of scanners and all kind of have their advantages and disadvantages. So maybe James, if you can talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I always tried to separate the developer experience from my experience as a security engineer. And so I was always trying to get them to interface with whatever lightweight hooks into their environment exist, knowing that it was going to miss some things, knowing that it wasn't like a simple example is a lot of SCA tools when they integrate to a GitHub repo are looking at the instructions for how to build the binary, which will miss things than if you were to actually scan the binary when it was done. You're going to get a totally different set of results. That's a lot more complicated to unravel. But I wanted developers to just focus on the simple that's there to get them thinking in terms of the patch management. How are we going to fix these things? Should I be importing this new package? Should I be using this new line of code? and getting them to use that stuff. And then I would always keep the deeper analysis scanning just for my own safety. And I wouldn't bring it up to auditors or whoever. It was just so that when Log4j happened, I could at least actually know, like, where is this thing deployed in my environment? At the end of the day, like the source of truth. And so there are a lot of cool things that you can do when you hit that level of data. And then especially when you're doing some of the emerging technologies around like runtime function level reachability, where you can actually see like what functions from an application are executing at runtime, and then use that to tie into your overall prioritization of your program. Really, it's about how all of this data, depending on where you scan, is going to look different. When you look at a CI/CD pipeline of like the binaries getting built and then it's getting deployed, and in between that, maybe the DevOps team has built a little injector that's putting a fun little script in there for you to find later. You really need the visibility every step of the way. But then the aggregation point comes down to prioritization for you, but then getting a relevant finding to the relevant developer in a way that's going to not create a lot of friction. And that's not going to be super confusing. Because a lot of junior developers will have no idea what their application actually looks like when it's finally deployed, because it goes through so many build steps along the way that they're trying to find the right person to fix any one of those vulnerabilities can be really, really difficult. So you need the whole visibility for yourself, and then you can kind of pick based on the team, how am I deduplicating these findings between different tools? How am I getting them to the right person?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges of kind of how do I create this picture that takes into account all of the context that I have from different tools, from different environments. And I think that's definitely one of the things that adds challenge to the entire process. Kayla, from your perspective about kind of how we scan.
Yeah. My biggest thing was I always wanted that one scanner to rule them all, always, because we are using a multitude of scanners because, I mean, we don't have one tool to rule them all, and maybe that's never going to happen. But it's all I ever wished for, because you're speaking different languages between different scanners. They're working in different environments. And then as we've kind of talked about, each of those unique vulnerabilities then need to be turned into one language and sent to the right owner. And so not only are the tools speaking different languages, but these vulnerabilities are being identified at different sections and stages of the SDLC, which means they're going to different people who all understand these things differently. So for me, I would have always loved to have that. But in place of that, we had to build our own aggregation capabilities to take all of these scanners, to take all the unique vulnerabilities, to take the CVE data, and to mesh that with our assets so that we knew who to go to and make sure that we are getting the vulnerability data to them through yet another tool in a way that they would understand.
Okay, and again, tapping into that. Okay, we have vulnerabilities. We've communicated them. We've communicated them. We kind of bridge that gap. What about the next phase? How do we fix? What's kind of your perspective into the remediation aspect?
So one of the key things for my life was that I was never the remediator. I was never the fixer. I found the problems via tools. I communicated those issues to the individuals who needed to do the fixing, but I was never the fixer. So that was definitely a challenge when, as I my disclaimer in the beginning, I'm not a developer. I am not a software engineer. And so helping these teams remediate was challenging. Because if I wasn't even set up for success, how could I expect them to be set up for success in actually fixing these things? So there was a lot of teamwork, let's say. Going back to that relationship I was able to build with these teams, where they would come to me and they'd be like, I don't know what you want me to do with this. You just gave me this vulnerability. What the heck am I supposed to do with this thing? And it was a team effort. We would all join hands and figure out how to remediate this thing because it was not something that all of us just had this innate experience to be able to do. So building the relationship was key so that they would trust me, to know that they could tell me, and then we'd be able to collectively work on getting stuff fixed.
Well, I think the remediation program can be a lot of different companies really under prioritize remediation guidance as part of how they prioritize vulnerability remediation overall. Because the danger is when you're not, like, so many vulnerability tools still work on like a CVE by CVE basis, where I always pushed instead to think in terms of like either container image layers or package layers. Because if I send out a common Java frameworks like Spring Framework, and if one CVE shows up and I send that to 30 different teams that use that framework, and they're all going to try to run their own little mini upgrades to try to fix it, like, I've just wasted a ton of business time, when in reality, one developer should have planned a Spring migration for the organization and then actually implemented that across all of the teams. And I just think that this remediation piece has been so underexplored, because at the end of the day, a developer is not the one buying a security tool. And so that's what makes it so that vendors are prioritizing the vulnerability prioritization piece. But more fundamental to that, the reason our vuln programs, I think, get the number only seems to go up is because remediation is really hard, or else the number would go down, because we're just patching things as services get redeployed. And so I think that hopefully more and more tools will start grouping things that way. But I think that's the main thing I look at is the bare minimum. I need to be grouping these things by package names and not individual CVEs, because that's security people think in terms of specific CVEs, especially on the compliance side, around what's the risk of this CVE, what's the CVSS score, what's the EPSS, what's the KEV, how do I prioritize it? But a developer thinks in terms of what package is this and how hard is it going to be to upgrade this package, and do we have a way to deploy this at scale?
When I hear CVEs and fixes, I think it's maybe a bit of another challenge that I'm facing. But we got that disclosure in an open source package lately, and it was an improper sanitization of the user input. And we were discussing it with the maintainer. We wanted them to fix it before we make public disclosure. It's public, so I'm not disclosing anything. But when we discussed it with the maintainer, he was saying that he thinks that it's not for what the package was built, and that it's not his responsibility to fix it, but rather the responsibility of the developers to make sure that their user input in their applications are sanitized. And it's at that point that I felt like I'm in the middle of a negotiation between the researchers and the reporters that disclose the vulnerability, and the maintainers and the developers that are using that package, and who's responsible of what, and who should make sure that this user input is sanitized. And I think that it goes, like, when we're talking in that sense about CVEs and fixes, it goes behind the vulnerability management process. I think that it's more about like ownership and expectations about who's responsible of what. And I think that if we could talk about those topics more and define maybe in a better way what are those expectations across the ecosystems, the vulnerability management could be better, or the communication between all of the stakeholders could be better.
So I will say that we kind of debated whether also to represent kind of this tension between the researchers and the maintainers, and I think that can be a different panel on its own. So I won't dive into that. Just an anecdote about what you said about. I remember that, I don't know if you remember, like a couple of years back, there was a vulnerability in XZ, I think, that was around in Python, or a zipping, in Python zip that has been in existence for 15 years. And I was like, so two things actually came to mind. So how that came to be. So the reason was that 15 years ago, when the vulnerability was reported and the CVE was issued, the maintainer said, that's not my problem. You just have to sanitize your input and you'll be fine. And way back in 2007, that was okay. And that's how it ended. So the vulnerability stayed in the code basically for 15 years. And then what came to mind as a researcher then, okay, so how come I'm not seeing that in every scan that I do? on the scanner, and then I found out that the CPE that was used 15 years ago was in a different format that most scanners simply don't support, and that's why the only reason that it isn't surfacing, because the vulnerability is there and it's strictly mentioned that it wasn't never fixed. So yeah, just an anecdote. It ties back to several points in the discussion. Okay, so given that, would you say, Havaya, that the vulnerabilities are actually a reflection of risk? Like the number of vulnerabilities is the
Yeah.
amount of risk you have?
So I think that when we're talking about risk, I would start talking about the CVSS, which I think is a great framework because it's like a common language and a baseline between all of the stakeholders. We all know what we're talking about when we talk about the severity of a vulnerability. But I think that in the context-driven era that we are living in, it's maybe not enough. And here comes the EPSS, which is showing us about the likelihood of exploitation of the vulnerability. And when we're looking at the EPSS distribution, we see that most of the vulnerability won't probably be exploited in the wild. And I think that that's very interesting because it shows us, like, when we're talking about risk, we're talking about impact and likelihood, and there is some impact and exploitation in the CVSS, but it's more related to the specifications of the vulnerability. And the EPSS is adding something about the likelihood of exploitation. But I think that when we're talking about risk, we're talking also about the context. It can be the business impact of if the vulnerability is being exploited in the context of the company or the organization. And it can be also the likelihood of exploitation. So yeah, we're talking about reachability. We're talking about like maybe also if it's transitive vulnerability or not, if it's in a dev dependency, and then we will probably just ignore the vulnerability. I think that we should move from vulnerability reduction to risk reduction, because risk reduction is more about reducing the vulnerability that truly matters in the context of our applications.
James?
Yeah, I think vulnerability management is in a weird place when it comes to risk and what we're actually doing. Because I think there are ways to run a vulnerability management tool and have it tell you something close to risk. But unfortunately, I don't think it's tied to a lot of the metrics that we're using, where it's more subjective things like, is this a hot vulnerability right now? Like Log4j was easy enough to send the payloads that a lot of people were doing it. And so, yeah, that was a bad one, but I don't know how much the different scoring mechanisms, prioritization things, it's always hard to tell how that's going to fit into your software. And so I think there's nothing, honestly, that replaces having just an actual view and understanding of how your software is made, which is why my normal advice for people at stuff is like learn Kubernetes, because unfortunately it's really hard to learn how your application works if you don't know how the underlying infrastructure happens. And I think that's what creates the risk, is if we use CVEs as sort of a crutch for an actual understanding of what's happening in our software deployment processes and our businesses. And the other side is, maybe it's because I came through an MDR provider and I have such a runtime view of things. But I think the other side of vuln management is we've separated it from a traditional view of security in like an operations context, is having an onion approach, right? Where I've got CrowdStrike on the box. Gosh, I can't believe I said CrowdStrike. We have some kind of endpoint protection on the box. We've got some kind of supply chain solution on the box. We've got firewalls in place. The move to cloud sort of abstracted away a lot of what vendors were using for what at runtime protection. But like at the end of the day, that was the mitigation. That was the last line of defense. So that I don't think anyone's being kept awake too much by like the latest Adobe vulnerability on their employees' laptop, right? Like we're not worried about a massive software infrastructure breach from like a CVE on an Adobe application. But we are worried about that when it comes to our running software, because we lack a lot of those runtime mitigations that are in place the way they are for different corporate devices and things like that. And so to me, all that to say, I think that our view of risk needs to expand both beyond CVEs to just actually understanding what's there, but also a lot of the runtime mitigation stuff That's actually there in the evolution of cloud runtime stuff, which I love to talk about. So
Yeah. So my quick thoughts for this one. Oftentimes scanning would just uncover poor build choices, poor configuration choices, poor software management choices. Like, you know, do we have to have like 10 versions of old Java hanging out in case we need to roll back? Like, how far are you going to roll back? Why do we have to hold on to all of those? Yet those are vulnerabilities. Each one counts as a mark against you if you have old software hanging out. And is it a risk? Like, I don't know. It's certainly a vulnerability. It certainly was identified by my scanner and it's going to go on the report. But does that mean it's an actual risk for the organization? That is certainly a conversation that organizations need to have, and they need to make that decision. And then the last thing I think here is that we have to really be careful with vulnerability management, not to over rotate on the reporting. Like I said, vulnerabilities become a number. And all of a sudden you have 100,000, you know, your bar graph is up here. You know, which business unit gets a gold star for knocking down more numbers? And we start to focus on how many of these we have, and you can't get past that. And it becomes a cultural issue if you over rotate on reporting. Like, that's what goes up to the executives, is how many vulnerabilities you've knocked down. Nothing about the maybe the real risk.
Yeah.
So that's definitely
Comes back to
something.
how you measure and what are you measured on. So real quick, because we're kind of getting short on time, maybe kind of what do you love and hate about security tools? Try to make it short. James, I think you will be concise, but
Yeah, I hate how many we have. I hate they're hard to set up, configure, customize, manage. And then the actual risk reduction is almost next to impossible for them because it's all about identifying. But I love that, like, when you get the right tool for the job, it's magic. And when you find the right vendor who's willing to partner with you to actually create something successful, that's the best.
James?
yeah, I think it's a love-hate thing where a lot of vendor products are super annoying. But the thing I say, it's because we're kind of annoying when we tell them what we want. And I just think about how many vendor choices I've made where I was evaluating based on number of detections. And then I turn around and I'm surprised that like vendors have a ton of false positives with a huge amount of numbers. It's because I asked for it. Like, I wanted to see the huge numbers of stuff. I just don't want to see it anymore now that I bought your thing. And so that's all that to say. That's me saying I don't like most vendor products, but I also think it's a little bit our fault.
Okay, so kind of to end things on kind of forward-looking, kumbaya, collaborative spirit. If each one of you had one tip, one recommendation, one advice for one of the stakeholders in the process, what would that be?
Mine would go to system owners, application owners out there. Asset inventory and management is the beginning of all of this. If you cannot document the things you're building and how you're building them and what that actually means to the organization, so the data you're processing, how critical is this thing? If you're not doing that, then it doesn't matter what the rest of the chain does because you don't understand the business context. So that would be my one ask, is if you build something, document the crap out of it.
My one ask would be to the security teams to continue focus on the developers and to continue focus on the vulnerabilities that matters the most in the context of the project or the application where they exist. I think that if we focus on that and we provide like the vulnerabilities that matters the most to the developers, and they don't just get vulnerabilities every day and they feel like it's a waste of time, it will be noise reduction, and it will also make the vulnerability management process more scalable and effective.
Yep. I mean, I already gave mine away. I would say learn Kubernetes because it's hard to, how do you even know you have an asset inventory? Like, if you're trying to do that for a modern cloud native architecture, and like it requires understanding how some of it works. But since I already said that one, I'll sneak in a second and say if something doesn't make sense to you, it's probably the tool's fault and not your fault. I really was kicking myself using so many different tools for so long when I was learning application security, thinking like, am I just stupid? Like, I don't understand like how this is a cross-site scripting or like SSRF or whatever. And the answer is like, it's a bad description that's not applicable to my environment and it doesn't make sense. And if there's a reason that every one of these basic questions, you have to talk to like the chief architect of the company to figure out, are we vulnerable to an SSRF? Because it's like a really complicated question that involves the whole architecture of your application and not just like this library exists or something. So, yeah.
Cool. Thank you. And thanks everyone, the panelists. I think we have a couple minutes left for maybe a question or two. If anyone wants
We
to.
do have a couple of questions on the Discord channel.
Sure.
So I'll start with one of them as people can conglomerate here. So sometimes development teams become too reliant on security teams in identifying vulnerabilities that don't self-report or take initiatives to preemptively fix security bugs if the scanners don't identify those issues. How do we empower development teams to feel ownership not only in fixing, but also identifying security bugs?
Give them an IDE plugin. I'm joking. That's a joke. The real answer is that they have to feel like security is a safe space conversation to have with them. That just because they report something doesn't mean they're going to spin up like a war room, that we're not going to hop in a chat with their boss, that we're not like creating all this friction. But this is the bottoms up relationship where they have to feel safe and be encouraged to talk about like, hey, this is this gnarly thing. And this is honestly, before you buy a scanner, if you want a real sense of where to start, like you can just ask your devs, like, hey, what's probably going to get us exploited? And they'd be happy to say, oh, it's this thing. Like, it's like a bragging thing. So if you just change the nature of the conversation, that can increase self-reporting.
Cool. Yeah, sure.
Deja vu moment, because I just had all of this conversation in one conversation that I've had about one CVE. So just to piggyback on what you said about the tools, I would like tools to stop trying to be the one tool to rule them all and to simply specify what their tool does, because I can cut a false positive conversation in half just by saying this tool scans for this version of this thing, true or not true. So that was that. My question.
Yeah, just on that, the problem is they're incentivized not to tell you what they don't do well. So yeah,
Of course.
but I'm completely with you.
But so then we have to, in vulnerability management, which is not one thing, is a bunch of different things. Sorry, lost my train of thought. Oh, yes. That the different conversations and the language from the developer and then from the person who's doing the scan and then the CEO and then the legal department and then the marketing department. Like right now, the fact that there's a legal definition for a vulnerability, that now I have to do things a little bit different. I started that. I did have a question at the start of that, but it's gone.
No, but it's a good note. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'll
Thank you.
release that.
I think we're at time, right?
Well, do you have a short one? All right.
Hey, Francisco.
Hello,
Oh.
Frank. Do we have a vulnerability and prioritization problem, or do we have an asset attribution and remediation problem in this industry?
No, I agree. It's an asset and remediation thing.
Yeah, I guess I agree too. I mean, if we're gonna go, I mean, asset management was like my number one thing anyways. And I think that, yeah, I agree.
Some would say we even have a software engineering problem. They're coming up with the vulnerabilities. So it's a question of how far back you go, but yeah, definitely a good point.
Awesome. That brings us to time right there. So another round of applause for our panel discussion today.